Hello and welcome to GB Face. My name is Tahir Ghazi. I'm joining you right outside San Francisco. This is GB Face, the Global Voices Hangout series. Currently joined in Copenhagen by Maryam Al Khawaja, who's an activist in Bahrain. Okay, we're getting a bit of feedback. Sorry, Maryam.
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. So Bahrain is in the third year of its crackdown against its popular uprising, and Maryam's family has been at the forefront of protests. Maryam's father, Abdul Hadi Al Khawaja, is currently serving a life sentence in jail, and Maryam's sister, Zainab Al Khawaja, who, like Maryam, is a prolific tweeter, also was recently sent back to jail. She is 8 months pregnant, and she was sentenced to jail for tearing a photo of the king in court. Maryam, how is Zainab doing?
Well, today she had a trial. We were actually all surprised when we heard that her case was actually sped up. She was supposed to have 7 days in prison on this new charge, which was publicly insulting the king, when she tore up a picture of the king while on trial for ripping a picture of the king. And today we received news, even though she was supposed to go to a renewal judge tomorrow, today we received news that they had sped up her case, and so she had a hearing today. She, of course, announced that she was boycotting the trial because the judiciary in Bahrain is neither independent nor fair, and she asked her lawyer not to attend either. And the judge basically delayed or adjourned the trial until the 30th of this month, where she will be sentenced. So it will be a sentencing hearing.
And how is your father doing?
Well, my father's still recovering from his hunger strike. He's had some health issues. He previously had health issues that were related to the torture that he was subjected to in 2011. And now, because of the several hunger strikes that he's been on, it's of course starting to take a toll on his health. So during this last hunger strike, he developed astigmatism in one of his eyes, which has been causing, of course, some problems for him. Which is one of the reasons, of course, that we also have been trying to get him released to Denmark, where he's a citizen, on humanitarian grounds, so that he can get treatment for both the torture that he was subjected to, as well as the other health issues that he's facing right now.
So oftentimes when we read about the protest in Bahrain or the uprising or even the crackdown initiated by the Al Khalifa family-backed government, we hear that it is a Shia-led revolution against a Sunni regime. Do you think that's an accurate description, or is it simplistic?
I think if we're talking about whether it's true or not, then yes, the majority of the population in Bahrain is Shia, so naturally the majority of any uprising will be Shia. That only makes sense. Just like if you're talking about Egypt, most naturally the majority of the uprising will be Sunnis. But why is it that when talking about Bahrain there's a reference to sects, and yet when you're talking about places like Egypt there's no reference to sects, or even other places? And the answer to this is because the Bahraini government has used sectarianism as the main tool of the crackdown in Bahrain. They wanted to create a sectarian discourse for several reasons. One, for internal reasons, because if they could create a split between the Sunnis and the Shias in Bahrain, that would give them more space to stay in power, because they would turn it, or they were hoping that they would be able to turn it into a sectarian struggle that's more amongst the population rather than it being a popular uprising from the people against the government. So that was one reason they wanted to create the sectarian discourse, which they of course worked very hard on, and we can get into that later. But another reason for that is because since the Iraq War in 2001, the word Shia is usually associated with Hezbollah, with Iran, and with other groups or countries like that. And so if they knew that if they could get the discourse to become the Shia-led uprising of Bahrain, that people will do the work for them. They will say, well, maybe this is linked to Iran. Well, maybe this is not really about people having popular demands, but rather this is something that has to do with sex, has to do with religion, and so on. And so I think that, yes, it is in a sense, and if we're talking about actual facts, if it's literally correct, then yes, it is correct. But why is it that this discourse, because in uprisings and in situations like ours, discourse is of the utmost importance. So why is it that the discourse in Bahrain is sectarian, whereas in other countries it's not?
And so, so I guess there's an adoption by mainstream media what the government wants to say, which is what we often see in many stories across the world. The government ends up having more say. So we're getting some feedback that there is some echo in when I'm speaking. So do you have another window open maybe for this that is causing that? Because there's only feedback when I'm speaking.
Yes, sure. I'll close all the other windows.
Great, thank you. So there's been a lot of, okay, there's still some, but I'll wait another few seconds.
One second. Sorry, I have a whole ton of windows open.
I'm guilty of that too.
All right, we should be all good now.
So in the last year, there's been a series of moves within the country that have been very surprising to someone like me sitting outside. For example, the High Shia Council was disbanded, right, earlier this year. And then some politicians were stripped of citizenship also. And they happen to be Shia. And some clerics, firebrand clerics who were aligned with ISIS were given a platform, and they released videos that were not banned within the country. Also, there have been some stories about mosques being raised around. How are these moves perceived by activists within Bahrain?
Well, of course, like I mentioned, the way that the government did the crackdown in Bahrain. I'll try the see if the sound is clear. The way that the government has done the crackdown since the beginning of the uprising in 2011 was to try and create a sectarian situation. And so how better to create a sectarian situation other than to go after a certain sect in every different aspect of the crackdown. In Bahrain, it wasn't if you were Shia and someone who participated in the protest movement, you will be a target. No, it was if you were Shia in general, you're a target. And so whether you were a businessman, a doctor, a student, a teacher, a professor, whatever it is, if you are of that sect, then you became a target for the government. And that's why when we saw the way that they went after people, the dismissals that happened, thousands of people were fired for their jobs on grounds that they had participated in protests. We saw the demolishing of mosques. More than 30 mosques were demolished. All of them, of course, belonging to one sect. And some of these mosques were historic. Highways had been rerouted so that they would keep the mosques in their places. And yet, in 2011, suddenly they came up with this excuse that these mosques, which have existed longer than the ruling family have in Bahrain, were not registered and thus had to be demolished. And so the entire way that they did the entire crackdown was very sectarian in nature. And of course, that, like I said earlier, that was because they wanted to create a sectarian narrative within the country. It was also to send a message to the Sunni minority in Bahrain that you're either with the Shia or you're with us. And so people had to pick sides. And this was made very clear when Nasser Al Khalifa, the king's son, came on national television in 2011 and threatened people during a show where he called in and said, "This is an island, you have nowhere to go, you're either with us or against us, and we're going to come for you." And so this was something that they weren't even trying to hide. It was something that was very obvious. The language that was used was very, very sectarian. The way that things were done were very, very sectarian. So none of this comes as a surprise. Now, taking that even a step further, this is not something that's new to Bahrain. If you look at the Bendergate report, which came out several years before the uprising happened, the Bendergate report was a report that was leaked by someone who was in government and then had left. He leaked documents from within the government that proved that there were basically secret cells that were being created within the government whose only motive was to create sectarian tensions, but also sectarian separation within the country. Because within the ruling family, there was this ideology that if they wanted to stay in power, they needed to separate the people. As long as the people stayed united as Bahrainis against the ruling family, then the ruling family was at threat. And so this is something that goes long back in Bahrain. It's not something that started in 2011. And of course, you'll see this kind of methodology used in so many different countries where you have despotic regimes, which is the main, the number one lesson in politics, divide and conquer. And so in Syria, it was Bashar al-Assad made it as if it was about Sunnis versus Alawites. In Egypt, Mubarak tried to make it sound as if it was Copts against Muslims, and so on and so forth. And you'll see this over and over again, and Bahrain is no different.
And specifically with Bahrain, the last 20 years, there have been some major demographic shifts. Also, could you talk about that?
Yes, of course. So one of the things that people usually don't know about Bahrain, which is very interesting, is that the majority of the police and military in Bahrain are politically naturalized. They're not originally Bahraini. And so part of the shift that the Bahraini government has been trying to do in Bahrain, which is the demographic change, is that they're trying to create a country in which the Shia become a minority. And part of doing that is by politically naturalizing people, and of course strictly Sunnis. They do not politically naturalize Shia. And so over the past 10 years, thousands of people have been brought into Bahrain from mainly Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, Jordan, sometimes from Iraq, and a few other countries, where they will receive citizenship upon arrival. They will receive a house and a car and then a job in the military or police. And so one of the things that I think was really interesting that you saw in Bahrain that you didn't see in many other places is that when we were protesting in 2011 out on the streets, the police who were shooting at us don't speak Arabic. They speak Urdu, because most of them are of Pakistani origin. And so one of the problems we had is that you can't even communicate with the police. So when you have a bunch of protesters, hundreds or thousands of protesters standing there screaming Silmiya, Silmiya, which means peaceful, and the police standing on the other side having no idea what you're saying, all they see is a crowd screaming at them, it adds an entire new level of problems to the situation that you're already in. And so this is, of course, one of the problems that we've been facing in Bahrain is with the demographic shift that the government is trying to do. But we've also seen this on other levels as well. There are unwritten rules in Bahrain, since before, of course, the uprising, where there are certain areas in Bahrain where Shias are not allowed to live. They're not allowed to buy land, they're not allowed to rent. And so there's this separation of sects within the country. Now they've made it a lot more visible. So for example, Ali is known as a Shia town, and Rafah is known as a Sunni town. And I saw this myself when I was back there this year, after I was released from prison. You drive from Ali, the road that leads from Ali to Rafah is completely blocked off, so that people can no longer go from Ali to Rafah. You have to go completely around. And so they're actually creating real barriers between Sunni and Shia neighborhoods even create even more a higher level of segregation between the two sects. There's also unwritten laws, for example, about employment. There are certain sectors in Bahrain where Shias are not allowed to work. Again, like I said, this is something that the Bahraini government has been working on for quite some time. And so it's been very well developed. And that's why when 2011 happened, they were already prepared for it. They were able to roll out that sectarian narrative that was already prepared for several years and use it to the utmost point so that they can create a sectarian narrative.
So you're saying there are actually laws that exist that say that Bahraini Shias cannot have certain jobs within the country? Or is this
unwritten laws?
It's unwritten laws.
Yes. I mean, to give you an example, my sister who studied to be a nurse, she had a colleague. So it's known that at the Bahrain Defense Force Hospital, the number of Shias are very, very minimal. Almost, I would say, 0 to 1%. And when he went for an interview to work there, he walked into the interview and he sat down. They asked him for his name. As soon as he said Mahdi, which is usually known as a Shia name, he was asked to leave. He wasn't even interviewed. And so it's unwritten laws, but these are things that have not even been really hidden in the past. It's something that's more or less become a norm, something that people know about, and that they feel they cannot change prior to 2011.
And what are the numbers like in Bahrain about Shias are the majority, but what is the percentage like? So if such a huge percent of the population is being forced to forced into unemployment, how does that pan out into the community?
Well, if we're looking at the most recent numbers we have are not very recent. They're quite old actually, and they're numbers that were put out by the U.S. State Department in their yearly report, which stated that according to their studies, Bahrain was approximately, I think it was 74 or 75% Shia, and most of the rest were Sunni. Now, since then, we've had the political naturalization that has happened in thousands and thousands of people, for thousands and thousands of people. And so the Bahraini government has refused to put out any kind of data on that. Because they know that it's going to be tremendous numbers, and it would show how they're actually creating that demographic shift within the country. And so they haven't allowed any kinds of numbers to come out on that issue. So right now we don't really know. I mean, there are people from the government who have now made claims that now the Shia are at 49% and Sunnis are at 51%. We have no way of verifying this, but it could be true given the amount of political naturalization that has happened over the past 10, 15 years.
Just a reminder, people can send us questions through the question and answer app on the Hangouts page. So Maryam, with something like this, like with the the threat of jail, the threat of unemployment, mosques being razed to the ground, what about the youth? What about the Shia Bahraini youth? What are they doing besides, if they're not becoming an activist like you, are they looking for jobs outside Bahrain? How are they moving forward? What are we seeing? Because education levels are really high in Bahrain. People are really well off. It's not really a situation where they don't economically they want to sustain a certain kind of living. What are most 20-somethings doing right now in Bahrain?
First, there's something I want to make clear. When the protest started in 2011, despite the the systematic sectarianism within the law, and whether it was written or unwritten laws, whether it was in employment or other sectors in Bahrain, when the protest started in Bahrain in 2011, this is another thing that's been written about wrongly in the media. People did not take to the streets because they wanted Shias to have more rights in Bahrain. That was never the demand. I was there in the streets with them. What people were demanding was that the king deliver on the promises he made in 2011 of a constitutional monarchy. And so it had nothing to do with Sunnis and Shias. And that's why you saw people from all sects of society taking part in the protest movement in 2011. And even when the killing started and people upped their demands, it was still not about Sunnis and Shias. It was about people demanding that the ruling family step down because they not only failed to deliver on the promises that they had already made, but they had started killing people for demanding that they deliver on those promises. And so I've seen a lot of articles these days that basically make that claim that, the majority Shia in the country are taking to the streets because they're demanding more rights for Shia citizens in the country. That has never been the case. On the issue of what youth are doing today, I think that there's another misconception that there's no poverty in Bahrain. And that's not the case either. Prior to 2011, one of the things that I did was I worked as a fixer for journalists who would come to Bahrain to do reports and interviews and so on. And some of the reporters that I worked with did reports on poverty in the country. And I visited some of the poorest neighborhoods and poorest households in the country. Honestly, I lived in Bahrain for 10 years, and before I visited these homes, I wouldn't have, if someone had told me that people were living in those conditions, I would not have believed it myself. It wasn't until I experienced it and I saw it with my own eyes, where I walked into homes that were not houses that were not fit to live in, where people lived in homes that looked like they come out from like 200 years ago, where the kitchen and the toilet were right next to each other, where they barely had, clean, the cleanliness level, the amount of people living in one rundown home and so on. There is this misconception that anyone who lives in the Gulf lives a good standard of life. And that's not the case. There are so many people who do live in poverty, who do live in houses that are about to fall apart. And that's not the case just for Shia in Bahrain. That's the case for a lot of Sunnis as well. The poverty is amongst both sects. So that's something that I think is important to clear up. In regards to the youth, that's been one of the strategies of the government. For a while, when they were politically naturalizing a lot of Sunnis, part of the process, which you can also read about in the Bandargate report, was driving young Shias out of the country. So basically giving them opportunities to leave the country and go work in other places. Or, for example, trying to set up offices where people can convert from Shiaism to Sunnism, and they would get paid to do that. So there were many different ways that they were trying to change the demographics. It wasn't just through political naturalization. Right now, there's different levels to this problem. First of all, you have the youth, of course, a large amount who are in prison. Bahrain has, I think, one of the largest or highest number of political prisoners per capita in the world, if not the highest. But the youth who are not in prison or who get released, what we've already seen in Bahrain is that many of the youth who are getting released from prison, who are looking for jobs, are not able to get employed, because now what the government has done is they've said anyone who gets out of prison and wants to work needs permission from the Ministry of Interior. And whether you're applying for work in the private or the public sector, you need that paper. And so what they do is they won't say no, they won't tell you we won't give you the paper, but they'll keep delaying it. So I met several youth when I was in Bahrain who basically had been out of prison for sometimes a year and a half or 2 years, but have still not received those papers and so cannot get employed. And so financially, they're doing really, really bad. And some of them have families to support. So the financial conditions, the economic conditions are pretty awful. I mean, looking at the current situation.
We have a question from Lilana Chawati, one of our contributors from Spain/Syria. She asks, she says, thank you for your coverage. Aside from the coverage done based on Shia versus Sunni approach, what other common mistakes or shortcomings do you see in mainstream media regarding Bahrain?
Well, I think, the main issue is the sectarian discourse. I mean, even when they talk about human rights defenders in Bahrain, a lot of times I've been referred to as the Shia activist or the Shia opposition activist. It appears as though they cannot write an article without referencing to the sect of the person in question. One of the things that I think really blew my mind was when a journalist was writing about a protest that he had witnessed in Bahrain. And he said that everyone at the protest was Shia. And my question was, did you actually stop every single person in that protest and ask them if they were Shia? Because they might not have been. Or were they all walking around with the word Shia, labeled on their forehead, and that's how you knew? I mean, these are just assumptions that they make, and it's entirely shifted into the sectarian discourse. And it just really frustrates me, because I know that part of the threat of using the sectarian narrative is that you create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Bahrain was not a sectarian discourse when it started, and it stayed that way for a very long time, but the media kept on referring to it in a sectarian discourse, and they kept using sectarian narrative. Now, if I'm someone who's sitting in Bahrain, and I'm reading articles about Bahrain all day long, and every single time I open an article it says the Shia uprising against the Sunni minority in Bahrain, and I'm from the Sunni minority, after a while it's going to start having an effect. I'm going to maybe start believing that this is actually a Shia uprising. So of course I'm not going to feel like that I'm in any way or could be, connected to the struggle. And so it actually has an effect on how the actual uprising evolves. So I think the most threatening part about the media when it comes to Bahrain has been the sectarian discourse. Apart from that is the connection, of course, with Iran as well. One of the things that I think, again, has been something that we've raised on many different levels was how there's always this question of, well, the connection to Iran. You say Shia, so there must be an Iran connection somewhere there. And yet, when we talk about Iran and the Iran threat in Bahrain, the only thing that we've seen from Iran so far are really ridiculous statements usually. Statements where they'll come out and say, oh, they should stop abusing human rights in Bahrain. Which, I mean, anyone who knows the human rights record in Iran would know that that's a ridiculous statement for them to make. At the same time, Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the other Gulf countries sent military forces into Bahrain. And yet nobody seems to be making that connection. We talk about the Iranian threat of statements that are affecting Bahrain, but the actual sending in of military into the country to help suppress a popular uprising doesn't really seem to do it for the journalists when it comes to talking about Bahrain. And again, that for me is something that really puts a massive question mark. Why is it that military intervention in Bahrain is not the thing that always comes up when we're discussing the issues of Bahrain, rather than statements that were made about Bahrain by Iran?
One thing is quite clear. I mean, to someone like me who has been reading a lot about this in international media and also on Global Voices, hearing voices like yours, that it's definitely somewhere along the line in the past 4 or 5 years, coverage of Bahrain, it became what the government wanted it to be. The frame that was put on Bahrain was the sectarian frame that the government wanted. If you could redo that, how would you want the story of Bahrain to be told? How would you want the uprising story to be told? What are the demands of activists? What do they want from the regime? They want the monarchy disbanded. And what other kind of rights do they want to see happening? How does oil play into all of this?
Those are all questions. I'll try to remember all of them. The first question and how we would rewrite it, I think, like I said, discourse is very important. And the way that I would like to see it happen is for people to report it the way that they would report any other case. You know, when Syria happened, when Egypt happened, when all these other countries happened, journalists didn't choose to use a sectarian narrative. They would talk about how there are problems. Like, for example, yes, there was a problem that was created by the government against the Copts to try and create a problem between the Copts and the Muslims. So yes, that's something that definitely needs to be talked about. I don't think we should ignore the fact that there are these issues within the community or within the society. But the fact is that if you were on the ground, if you were there with the people, you would know what it's about. It was about Bahrainis taking to the street, asking for rights. The minute the media decided to label them within their sect, they changed the entire discourse on the entire struggle. And that has made it only so much more difficult for people in Bahrain, even internationally. I mean, every single conference that I go to, if I'm sitting on a panel with one activist from every other country where there's been uprisings, I'm always the activist that will get asked about the sectarian issue in my country. None of the other activists get asked about that. And it's not that I have a problem with being asked about it, because I have no problem answering those questions. But I think it really says a lot as to what the media, the kind of sectarian discourse that the media has helped create. And it's one of the things that also frustrated me a lot is that I knew some of these journalists who wrote about Bahrain using sectarian narrative. And when I met them, I told them, you've been to Bahrain. You've seen Bahrain. You've met people in Bahrain. You know that this is not the case. Why are you using that narrative? And they tell me that that's what the editors want. Even if they don't want it, that's what the editors want. And so it's obvious that it's something that was focused on because, you know, as they put it, it's the sexy story that everyone wants to hear. So for me, it's a discourse that I would definitely change. I think it's the real stories of the people that need to be told. In regards to oil, I don't think with Bahrain specifically, oil is not the biggest issue. Bahrain is not, you know, oil is not the biggest industry in Bahrain. It's banking and finance. The reason why oil does come into question is because of Bahrain's alliance and relationship with the other Gulf countries, and especially Saudi Arabia. I believe if Bahrain did not come as a part of the GCC, it would be a different situation for all of us. It wouldn't be as difficult trying to get international accountability for the government of Bahrain. But because Bahrain is always seen to come in a package with the rest of the GCC countries, it becomes so much more difficult to get other countries to speak out about the human rights situation inside Bahrain.
Thank you. Do you have any last words? What are your hopes for Zainab's situation? Are you hoping that she will be released in the next few days? She is due soon.
Of course, I hope to see Zainab free, just like I hope to see the more than 3,000 other political prisoners free as well. But I think, you know, Zainab, my father, Nabil Rajab, all of these people who are sitting in prison cells inside Bahrain, getting them released is not the only objective. It's changing the system that allows a situation in which these people get arrested and put in prison that needs to be changed. Our problem is not, I mean, if we're going to look at the bigger picture, our problem is not with these people being arrested specifically. It's about the system that creates the situation that allows for them to be arrested. Zainab can get out tomorrow. There's no guarantee that she won't be rearrested in a week, in a month, in a year. You know, there's always that situation where she could be rearrested. It's the same situation with my father. It's the same situation with Nabil and everyone else. What we need to do in Bahrain is change the situation so that there's a government that actually respects human rights, so that we actually create a situation where these people will not only not be put back in prison, but will be respected for what they do, will be awarded for the kind of work that they do for the citizens of Bahrain. And I think that's where we need to reach. You know, that one question that you asked me that I didn't respond to was, what was the main demands that people want to see for Bahrain? The demand that I hear over and over again in Bahrain right now, and especially from the youth, is something that is a part of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. Their demand is, we want the right to self-determination. And I think that that's something that people have a right to, because it's, you know, at the forefront of every single struggle. It's the right for a people to choose what kind of government they have and to choose who represents them.
Thank you, Maryam, for joining us. We had one last question, but I think you sort of answered that in your response just now. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be bringing you GB Face next week, and we're going to be talking about asylum seekers around the world. Specifically, we're going to be talking about some cases in Australia and Europe, and the lashback that we're not seeing against some refugees and asylum seekers. Thank you, Maryam, for joining us. I'm wishing you the best of luck. We're always reporting your stories, trying to tell the real story from Bahrain, shift the frame away from sectarianism, back to what it should be about, self-determination of the people, and really keeping my fingers crossed for Zainab being released soon, and your father as well, Abdul Hadi Al Khawaja. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.